before I actually start, is just recognize the sponsors for this class. This class has been a collaborative effort, not just among the teaching staff and the panelists that we've had, but among many units in the university, and I'm not sure that we've taken a moment to thank them publicly, and so I'd like to do that. We had several sponsors for this class: the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, our very own David Grusky directs that center, the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education, the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, the Program on Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Stanford Center for American Democracy, the Distinguished Careers at Stanford, and the Office of the Provost. All of those units have made very generous contributions to this class to make it happen, and so I want to thank them. But the task at hand today is to take on inequality and the election. And this class has focused on a kind of three axes of inequality, those being race, class, and gender. Primary unit hosting this class is the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and so the topic of race has been infused into all of those discussions. Today we raise up the topic of economic inequality, recognizing fully that none of these axes of inequality stand on their own, but we are choosing to emphasize this particular axis. And we do so in view of some long and short-term trends related to economic inequality. The long-term trend is very clear. It is that the American economy has expanded tremendously. Nobody has copyrighted that word yet. I think I can still use the word tremendous. The American economy has expanded over the last 4 decades tremendously, and yet the gains that resulted from that economic expansion have gone to very few. You can slice the data in a million different ways, and you will ultimately come to the same conclusion, which is that there are very few taking home a lot and keeping a lot, and there are a lot taking home very little. That's the long-term trend, and I think you'll hear more about that in the next couple of hours. The short-term picture is that the economy actually looks pretty good. It's been about 8 years since the start of the Great Recession, and in that time, we have gone through what some would say is the worst economic downturn since the Great Recession. But we are now at a place where unemployment is under 5%, and wages are rising across all jobs, although modestly among lower paid jobs. But I would argue that the politics of this election has picked up on the long-term trend. It's safe to say that the politics of this presidential election have struck a distinctly populist tone. Donald Trump has offered a fairly bleak view of the economy, attributing the declining fortunes of particularly working class Americans to shrinking manufacturing sector, bad trade deals, immigration, regulation, and taxes. On the Democratic side, really beginning with Bernie Sanders, there was also a strong populist tone, and in many ways, Hillary Clinton has taken up the mantle of populism from the Democratic side, leaning on a kind of tried and true script of Democratic populism related to raising the minimum wage, improvements to education, paid family leave, reducing college debt, and so forth. She has also, in some ways like Donald Trump, expressed some reticence about particular trade deals, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But that populism also has an overtly racial tone to it, especially on the right. Now, Donald Trump has made appeals to working class blacks, asking them what do they have to lose given his portrayal of their situation in rather bleak terms. But that populist appeal has been mostly reserved for a white working class population. And in particular, Donald Trump has taken on immigration as one of the leading causes of multiple ills, but including the decline in the fortunes of the white working class, although he wouldn't explicitly put it that way. And the white working class has responded very favorably. They favor Trump, according to the latest polls, by about 2-1 over Hillary Clinton. And that populism, that racially laden populism, have left pundits to wonder, what is it about the white working class that finds the Trump message so appealing? Why has America left the white working class behind? Now, interestingly, the populations that we typically think of those who are most adversely affected by the axes of inequality that I talked about, particularly blacks and Latinos, have not caught on to Trump's appeal. In fact, there are some states where polling was at near zero in terms of favoring Trump among blacks, and it appears so far that Donald Trump will break a record if the polls are right. If the polls are right, he will break a record for having gotten the lowest Latino vote for share in modern presidential history. So today we take up a couple of questions with a very distinguished panel. The first question we take up are how are race and inequality feeding into the politics of the presidential election today? But we also want to look at policy. We're not just concerned about the presidential election itself, we're concerned about what the next president does about income and race inequality. And so our panelists have been asked to take up the question, what should the next president, if anything, do about racial and racial and economic inequality? We have a panel of 3 distinguished observers of these trends and their solutions to help us answer those questions today. And I'm going to introduce all of them, and then I'll ask the first to come up and offer some remarks. I will then have maybe 2 short questions serving in my role as moderator, and then we'll turn it over to all of you to engage in a discussion with our panelists. So our first panelist is David Grusky. David Grusky is the Barbara Kimball Browning Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences, and he's the director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality and the co-editor of Pathways magazine, and you should have all been able to read the winter edition of Pathways magazine for this class. His research addresses the changing structure of late industrial inequality and addresses such topics as the role of rent-seeking and market failure in explaining the takeoff in income inequality, the amount of economic and social mobility in the US and other high inequality countries, the role of essentialism in explaining the persistence of extreme gender inequality, and the forces behind recent changes in the amount of face-to-face online cross-class interaction. He's also involved in projects to improve the country's infrastructure for monitoring poverty, inequality, and mobility by exploiting administrative and other forms of big data more aggressively. His recent books include Social Stratification, Occupy the Future, The New Gilded Age, The Great Recession, The Inequality Reader, and The Inequality Puzzle, all of which have been written since 2010. Second panelist is Sean Reardon. Sean Reardon is a professor of poverty and inequality in education and professor by courtesy in the Department of Sociology here at Stanford University. He's also the director of the Stanford Interdisciplinary Doctoral Training Program in Quantitative Education Policy. His research focuses on the causes, patterns, trends, and consequences of social and educational inequality, the effects of educational policy on educational and, the effects of educational policy on educational and social inequality, and in applied statistical methods for educational research. In addition, he has developed methods of measuring social and educational inequality and methods of causal inference in educational and social science research. He teaches graduate courses in applied statistical methods with a particular emphasis on the application of experimental and quasi-experimental methods to the investigation of issues of educational policy and practice. Finally, we have Dominic Apollon. Dominic Apollon is a research director at Race Forward, which is an organization that advances racial justice through research, media, and practice. He has examined the distribution of toxic waste in the state of California from 1989 to 1999, as well as the corresponding grassroots political activity and participation. Dom has taught undergraduate seminars on politics and race and ethnicity at Stanford, as well as a number of other universities. He has also been on the faculty in the political science department at California State University, Bakersfield, where he taught courses in constitutional law, American politics, environmental politics, and the presidency. He received his doctorate from our very own Stanford University Department of Political Science in 2003, and he has co-authored reports for Race Forward such as don't call them post-racial, millennial attitudes on race, racism, and key systems in our society, the color of food, better together, research findings on the relationship between racial justice organizations and LGBT communities, underprotected, undersupported, low-income children at risk, and Check the Color Line, a 2009 income report. So I'd ask you to join me in welcoming all three panelists at this time. And I'm going to ask David Grusky to come forward and share his remarks.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation extended by Tomás and by Gary. Because time is short, I'm going to get right to it. I want to take on the commonly advanced argument that Trump has been especially successful in exploiting the takeoff in income inequality, the takeoff to which Tomás referred, and has done a good job of building a coalition around that takeoff and its implications. And I have here on the lead slide a piece by Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institution that lays out the argument that inequality built the Trump coalition. So what is meant by the claim that inequality built the Trump coalition? Now, I should say that Richard Reeves put forward this argument with a lot of subtlety, and I'm not going to be able to capture that subtlety. It's a very, very, very compelling argument, but I want to give it in its broad brush form, and that form simply states that, as Tomás already discussed, there's been a substantial takeoff in income inequality. The economic growth of the last 40 years or so has disproportionately gone to the top 5% to the top 1%, whereas if you're in the middle of the income distribution or below, you didn't see much of that growth. And then the argument, furthermore, is that if you haven't seen much of the growth of the last several decades, then you're vulnerable to an argument that we can change that we can generate a new economic system that shares the growth more equitably. What I want to argue, and there's a lot of discussion of this argument. I'm not going to rehearse the various counter arguments that have been advanced, but rather I want to make a very simple point, and that's that this takeoff in income inequality is going to be politically weaponized most effectively insofar as you can make the case that the takeoff is driven by, if you will, bad forms of inequality, by inequality that's illegitimate. In other words, if you can make the argument that it's a rigged system and that those who have benefited disproportionately from economic growth have done so not through forms of investments that we would see as legitimate. And so I'll lay out that argument in more detail. And the question is how can inequality be politicized in this way? And the basic claim here that I'm going to try to pad out a bit more is that rising inequality is going to lead to dissatisfaction and hence be politically weaponized insofar as it's deemed illegitimate, right? So how do you come to understand inequality as illegitimate in the context of a society such as ours that is founded on a commitment to competitive market economies? Well, you show that inequality isn't the outcome of a fair and open competition in which merit, talent, initiative, and drive are rewarded, right? And in economics terms, you have to show, in other words, that there's a lot of rent in play within the economic system. Rent that's generated because there are non-competitive processes in play that lead to a rigged system and that allow people to capture economic rewards without having, if you will, the merit and the marginal product to justify that capture. Okay? So any type of non-competitive process that leads to economic rewards in excess of what would prevail within a competitive economy can be understood as a type of rent, a type of rigged system, if you will, to use the common parlance. Now, what's the most frequently discussed form of rent? It's probably CEO pay and rising CEO pay. Part and parcel of this takeoff in income inequality has been a substantial increase in CEO pay in many countries, including the US. And many folks, not everyone, it's very contentious, but many folks see that as an example of rent increasingly in play at the top of the income distribution, as an example of a rigged system. And the claim is that because the company's board essentially sets the CEO's compensation package, and because that board is appointed at the behest of the CEO, there's good reason, there's a smoking gun here, if you will, that suggests that they have an interest to appease the CEO, ensure that they can remain on the board, and garner, therefore, all the advantages that board membership implies. So there's a smoking gun that suggests it's a rigged system, that suggests that it's not the marginal product of the CEO that's being rewarded here necessarily, but rather there are good reasons to set a very liberal compensation package for reasons of personal interest on the part of those who are on the board. So goes the argument, at least, and that's then seen as the classic example of rent in play, and in particular rising rent insofar as CEO compensation is increasing. So this type of rent, this growing rent at the top of the income distribution, as most commonly revealed in rising CEO pay, this type of rent is attacked by both Clinton and Trump, right? They both rail against this type of rent. Clinton got into that type of language perhaps more aggressively because of Sanders, but nonetheless, both have been deploying that kind of rhetoric in which they attack growing rent at the top of the income distribution. They see that type of increase in inequality as illegitimate, as the consequence of a rigged system, and they're both attacking it, right? So that, in that sense, they're similar, right? But if you now turn to the loss of rent, here I think you see big divergence between the two candidates, okay? So to understand rising income inequality in the US, you have to understand that there are two types of rent dynamics in play. At the top, there's an increase in rent, as again evidenced by rising CEO pay. But at the bottom of the income distribution, there's a lot of loss of rent in play. And it's the combination of loss of rent at the bottom and growing rent at the top that generates then lots of income inequality. So what do we mean by loss of rent? Well, first off, there's loss of class-based rent. And here the conventional example is the union wage, right? So union wage could be seen as a type of rent. It's a type of rent that a lot of us who are liberal like, but it's rent nonetheless, okay? It's rent because it's a departure from competitive practices. In effect, you get the union wage by restricting competition, by saying that the only folks who can compete for particular jobs that are covered by the union are those who are a member of the union. That protection from competition allows unions to successfully negotiate in ways that allow them to set wages that would be in excess of what prevails under a wholly competitive system in which everyone can compete for particular jobs, right? So it's a type of rent. It's a type of a breach of competition that allows unions to negotiate successfully on behalf of their members. It's a type of rent that's also inequality reducing, right? Because the benefits of union membership principally go to the folks who are in the middle or bottom of the income distribution, right? So it's an inequality reducing form of rent. And the big development of our time is that kind of rent is in decline as unions become ever less common in the US. So that's a class-based form of rent, and that's not the only type of rent that's declining at the bottom of the income distribution. You can also talk about national border rent. What do we mean by that? Well, insofar as capital is freed up to be allowed to invest in other countries, to build, say, manufacturing facilities in other countries besides the US, that's introducing competition to workers in the US from workers in other countries, and that undermines their wages, right? So what a worker would want is, of course, that sort of flow of capital to be precluded, so that they can be guaranteed those manufacturing jobs. But insofar as that flow of capital is allowed, their rent is now under threat, right? That type of rent's, of course, declining as well. Bad news for folks in the manufacturing sector. And that's not all. There's also what might be called gender rent, right? We know from lots of good research, some of it carried out here, that if you're a woman and a particular mother, you're going to be at a disadvantage at the point of hiring, and that's a type of rent. It's a type of rent that actually transfers money from women to men, because it means that a man is operating with protection from full competition, right? The man is being protected from competition from highly skilled women who, absent that discrimination, would be contenders for the job in question. But insofar as there's discrimination, insofar as employers have tastes for one gender category over another, then it's going to privilege the preferred category, in this case men, and that's a type of rent. It's a transfer of money in effect from women to men. Now that type of rent is again surely still in play, but less prominent likely now than was the case in the past. And the exact same story prevails with respect to race. That type of rent is in play in the same sorts of ways, still clearly present, but arguably less so now than in the past. So the upshot is there's lots of destruction of rent going on at the bottom of the income distribution, destruction of rent that's increasing inequality, and think about what it means for the white male in the manufacturing sector. That white male in the manufacturing sector is losing out with respect to all of these types of rent destruction, right? And the claim then is that Trump, unlike Clinton, is all in when it comes to rent restoration. He wants to get that rent back. And that's an appealing argument. Now, I should say here that the folks who are beneficiaries of this rent may not see it as rent, right? They may see, in fact, that in the past it was just a fair return for merit and initiative and drive, and now it's a rigged system, right, in which that fair return is being undermined. That would be how it's represented, but in fact, based on the best empirical analyses available, that's a misrepresentation. It's rent that was very much in play in the past, maybe slightly dissipated now, still in play now, but slightly dissipated. It's just a matter of a loss of rent, a loss of advantage on the part of say, African Americans, on the part of whites and men. So the claim that I'm making to this point is that Trump is all in. He's all in when it comes to rent restoration at the bottom of the income distribution. All in. All types of rent that were once very, very well developed should be restored to the level that prevailed earlier. Whereas Clinton, by contrast, is less sympathetic to rent restoration as an across-the-board policy. She's going to pick and choose. Some types of rent should be restored. Other types of rent are wholly illegitimate and the process of rent destruction should continue apace. So why is she not all in when it comes to the rent restoration project in the way that Trump is all in, I would contend? Well, because she has other commitments, right? She has, for example, an egalitarian commitment. And that commitment to the egalitarian project will sometimes trump a commitment to a rent restoration project. So, because she has this egalitarian commitment, she's not going to be all in when it comes to restoring rent that in the past privileged whites and men. The egalitarian commitment will be more important than the rent restoration commitment, unlike what's the case for Trump. The other commitment that Clinton has that I think undermines this full-throated rent restoration commitment is the commitment to the growth project, right? So she wants economic growth, and she's not willing to support rent restoration if she's convinced that there's going to be substantial costs with respect to growth. And that means that some trade agreements, not all, but some trade agreements are going to be looked upon sympathetically by Clinton and not by Trump. So I want to step back a bit, and this is what Tomás asked us to do, step back a bit and say, no matter who wins this race, what are the kinds of challenges they're going to face in the context of these changes in the dynamics of rent that I've sought to lay out here. And I think if you look at the landscape, you look at the dynamics of rent and how those dynamics are changing, you have to be impressed by how many people have grievances and how difficult it's going to be to satisfy all those folks who have grievances. So now some of these grievances are pretty unsurprising, right? So let's say you're a woman and you have read the best social science and have experienced the implications of that research, and you know that there's a lot of discrimination in play at the point of, say, hiring. That's pretty illegitimate, right? And you're going to have a grievance to the effect that we're not living up to our commitment as a country that says it should be a fair and open competition, that merit should prevail, that hard work, initiative, and drive should prevail, and that everyone should have a fair shot no matter their gender. And you're gonna hold Clinton's feet to the fire and say, yeah, you know, we shouldn't have discrimination in this country. It's not what a full and honest competition is about. And you're gonna have a grievance. And Clinton's going to have to deal with that. And the same kind of argument holds with respect to blacks and immigrants who also experience discrimination at the point of hiring and elsewhere, right? That's a type of rent extraction, as I've argued. And folks who are suffering by virtue of that type of rent extraction have a grievance. And they'll prosecute it, and rightly so. That's not surprising, right? But here's another type of grievance that's perhaps a little more surprising. Those folks who are losing rent, still benefiting from it, but losing it a bit, they also have grievances, right? So, for example, think about white rent. Most whites, or many whites who benefit from rent in this way, benefit, say, from hiring discrimination that privileges whites, would deny that there's rent, right? And when they see then a loss in those advantages over time, they see that as evidence of a rigged system now in play, rather than simply the loss of some of the advantages that have historically been very profound and are still very much in play, but perhaps a little bit less so. Same deal with male rent, right? They want the previous more substantial rent to be restored. Males do, and so they have grievances, right? Same with class rent, right? So working class folks would like the more substantial rent that they had in the past to be restored. They want the union wage to be restored. They see unions as a way in which the power imbalance between employers and employees can be rectified, and think that union commitment should be renewed, and that more rent of that sort should be drawn. So all of these folks are ones who are losing rent. They still have some, but they're losing rent, and they have grievances as a result. Now here's a final type of grievance that's perhaps a bit surprising. Even those who are getting lots of rent and arguably getting more over time still have a grievance, right? So think about those folks at the very top, say CEOs. Most people, not everyone, but most people think that's a form of rent extraction that's in play. And it seems to be an ever more successful form of rent extraction, and they still have grievances, right? They think they're being paid precisely what they're worth, maybe not even as much as they're worth. They feel that they're not being appreciated for all the jobs they create, and hence they have grievances, and they're going to prosecute them as well, right? So all of this means is that the next president's got a lot of grievances to deal with. And perhaps they could be adequately dealt with if we were living in a high-growth society, but it's very unlikely that we're going to get back to the level of growth that prevailed in the early part of the 20th century, and hence it's going to be a difficult terrain to negotiate. Last slide. just to summarize what I've sought to lay out here. So the argument that I've made is that Trump is really the rent candidate, the rent restoration candidate. That's what makes him tick. He's committed, he's all in to restoring rent, all types of rent. If there's lots of rent in the past and there's not as much now, we got to get back to the past and get that rent back up, right? And it doesn't matter if it's inequality generating rent or not. So if for example, if it's equality generating rent, if it's the kind of rent that privileges, say, the manufacturing sector and workers in the manufacturing sector, he's fine in trying to restore that type of rent. But if it's inequality generating rent, race rent, gender rent, he wants to restore that too. Just wants to get back to the levels of rent that prevailed before. That's not the coalition that inequality built. It's rather the coalition that rent restoration built. So I think the tagline is a bit off. It's all about restoring rent. It's not about dealing with inequality. And Clinton, by contrast, is committed to the rent restoration project only if it's equality generating. So her commitment to reducing inequality is far more substantial than her commitment to restoring rent. So she's going to pick and choose among the types of rent that are in play and only commit to restoring forms of rent that will reduce inequality. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Now we have Sean Rudin.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomás, for the invitation to be here, and thank you all for coming out on an anxious election eve when you've probably heard more than you want to about this election. So I have to say I very much enjoyed David's insight into sort of what drives some of the politics here. I am not going to be as insightful about the politics of the election because I'm not a political scientist nor a political analyst of any sort. And what I study is really education and educational opportunity, which have been virtually non-existent as topics of discussion in this election cycle. I have no idea what a President Trump would advocate for, other than maybe getting rid of the Federal Department of Education. Because he hasn't spoken about it, he hasn't got policy papers on it, he hasn't talked about who his advisors would be, and the only reason I have some idea of what a President Clinton would do is because she has a longer track record on these issues, not because she's really talked about them in this election cycle. Other than Bernie Sanders, who talked a lot about higher education and college debt and trying to reduce or eliminate the cost of college and eliminate college debt. There really hasn't been much conversation about education and educational opportunity in this election. Secretary Clinton has talked about the college issue, really, I think, prodded on because Bernie Sanders was talking about it, and she sort of needed to in order to sort of signal to his coalition that she was their person. But there's been virtually no substantive discussion of it. I saw 2 of the 3 debates, and there wasn't a single question about education. So we really know very little in terms of from the candidates about what they would do about education. Clinton has been very active in advocating for early childhood education in the past. I read one interview with her in The Atlantic where she talks a lot about early childhood education. So my best guess is she'll care somewhat about early childhood education, but really we don't have any specifics. So rather than speculate, I thought I would sort of share with you some findings from recent research that I and some others have done and give some advice to our next president, whoever that might be, about the kind of things he or she should think about in terms of education and educational opportunity. How do I go forward? There we go. So 4 pieces of advice. One is, if we're really going to think about education and educational opportunity, we have to attend to the vastly unequal distribution of educational opportunity in the United States. So this is a picture based on new data that I've assembled, and this is a picture of the average test scores, the average academic performance of every of the 12,000 school districts in the United States. Purple means scoring below average on tests, green above average. The distance from those dark green to those dark purples is about 5 grade levels of difference. So we live in a country where, depending where you live, the opportunities to do well in school vary dramatically. And you can see large parts of the South and parts of the West are very low in terms of educational opportunity. Other parts of the country, particularly along the eastern seaboard, much higher educational opportunity. I think it's important to refer to this as measures of educational opportunity and not just measures of test score, because the only difference you would see, the only reason you would see these systematic differences in test scores is if there's systematic differences in opportunity. And those might be opportunities provided by the schools, but it also might be opportunities or the lack of opportunities due to neighborhood conditions, due to the availability of preschool programs or high-quality childcare, and due to the resources that families can provide in home and out of school. So think of this as a map of educational opportunity in America. And you can see we have a lot of inequality of opportunity to consider. This is those same data, but now each dot here is a school district, and the horizontal axis represents the socioeconomic conditions in that school district, with the I'm trying to get my left from my right. Your left is the more poor and socioeconomically disadvantaged school districts, and the right is the more affluent ones. And the vertical axis, which has kind of crept over into the middle of the picture there, is a measure of the average achievement in that school district measured at sort of in grade levels. And so again, you can see this very, very strong relationship between the socioeconomic conditions where kids grow up and their performance. So we live in a society where we have a lot of economic segregation and where that's very related to the opportunities kids have. So if we're going to sort of think about educational opportunity from a federal policy perspective, I think we need to take this into account. Now, it wasn't always quite this dramatic. If you, this is a feature of Macs, I've noticed. They migrate the vertical things into the middle of the picture. So sorry about that. But this is a picture of the achievement gap between high and low income students. That's the black line. And achievement gaps between white and black and white and Hispanic students. Those are the blue and the red lines. The trends in those achievement gaps over the last 60 or so years. And the story here, in some ways, mirrors the story of the rise of economic inequality in the United States. That is, the achievement gap, the difference in educational opportunities and performance between high and low income children has grown dramatically, starting with kids born in the mid-70s through today. So now those gaps are much larger than the racial gaps, whereas in the 1950s and 60s, the gaps between high and low income children were much smaller than the racial gaps. In some ways, you can sort of think of this as the story of inequality in the second half of the 20th century in America. That is, the 50s and 60s were an era of enormously high racial inequality in every dimension of life and historically low economic inequality. And now we live in an era of historically high economic inequality and still quite high racial inequality, but not as high as it was in the 50s and 60s. So the achievement gaps sort of trace out those patterns of opportunity. So I think to sort of background any conversation about education policy, it's useful to have these sort of stylized facts in mind. The second thing I think we have to consider in education, as in other domains of life, both race and class are still really salient. So there's a kind of a politics of post-racialism or the post-racial fantasy. That is that what really matters now is economic inequality, and that we've sort of finished racial. We have a black president, and so aren't we kind of done with that? And I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of conversations about race that this country's been having over the past few years, in particular around police violence and racial inequality and criminal justice system is partly, in some ways, a conversation about the fact that race still really matters in America, or an argument about whether it really matters in America. And I think in the education data, it's easy to see that race and class still matter. So for example, this picture shows that your probability of going to an elite selective college, depending on the income of your parents. And so on the far left here is the poorest families, and the far right is the richest families. And so if you're born to sort of a family whose income is in the 60th or 70th or 80th percentile of the income distribution or below, your chance of going to a very selective college are quite low, but they go up dramatically if you're born to a family at, say, the 90th or 95th percentile of the income distribution. So income clearly matters. Now, it doesn't matter just because your parents can pay for that. That's not really why this graph looks the way it is. It looks like that because of the picture I showed you before, which is that kids who grow up in high-income families have a whole lot more educational opportunities, both at home, but also in their neighborhoods, their communities, and their schools. And it's that gets them the kind of preparation and the credentials that gets them admitted to a highly selective college. It's not driven by actual ability to pay for college. It's driven by ability to pay for the kind of community where you get lots of opportunities. That's where that comes from. So that's the income story. But what does it look like if we look at it by race? If race didn't matter, you'd see the line for black students and white students and Hispanic students look exactly the same here. It sort of wouldn't matter what race you were. It would just matter what income you were. So this is what the lines look like for whites, blacks, and Hispanic students. And you can see at any level of the income distribution, but particularly at the top of the income distribution, your chances of going to a selective college are much, much higher if you're white than if you're black or Hispanic and have exactly the same family income. Now, we know there's not as many black and Hispanic families at the top of the income distribution, so they're more likely to be down in the lower half of the income distribution. But even among those who are, they have a much, much lower chance of going to a selective college. They have a much less chance of living in a kind of community where they have high-quality schools and lots of opportunities. So there is a dimension here in which race matters above and beyond class, or class matters above and beyond race. That is to say, they're both still quite salient. Every kind of educational data we look at shows this same kind of pattern. So when we're sort of thinking about educational equality, we can't just move to a kind of a race-blind kind of economic set of policies when we're thinking about, say, affirmative action, or we're thinking about desegregation or anything like that. We've got to still, I think, keep race in the equation. And so that suggests that the third thing to think about is that we've got to combat residential and school segregation because they're major obstacles to equal opportunity. So this is not easy to do, but let me just show you some of the patterns. So my colleague Kendra Bischoff and I looked at patterns of segregation by income over the last 40 years in the United States. And so this picture shows you the proportion of families who live in either very poor communities or very affluent communities. The affluent communities are blue, the poor communities are red, or kind of middle-class communities, those sort of light blue and pink colors. And in 1970, 2/3 of all families in the United States lived in middle-class, mixed-income communities. And only 1 in 6 lived in either a really affluent community or a really poor community. By 2012, only 40% of families lived in those mixed income middle class communities, and over 1/3 lived in either very affluent or very poor communities. So we've gradually, over the last 40 years, become a much more economically segregated society, which means that if you're poor, not only does your family have fewer resources than if you were middle class or rich, but you're much more likely now to live in a very poor neighborhood than you were 40 years ago. And so you're sort of doubly disadvantaged by both the limitations of your family's resources, but also the limitations of your neighborhood resources. But it's not only economic segregation that matters. Racial segregation is still quite pronounced in the United States. So one way of measuring racial segregation is just to sort of look at how racial segregation patterns intersect with economic patterns. So if you just say, what's the average proportion of poor students in a student school, or what proportion of students go to schools with high numbers of poor students. This is one way of looking at that. So if we characterize a high poverty school as one in which 75% of the students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, that is, they're relatively poor. 48% of Black and Hispanic students in the United States go to high poverty schools. Only 7.5% of white students go to high poverty schools. And school poverty is a very, very strong predictor of the quality of the school. It's very hard to have high quality schools consistently in conditions of very high poverty. It's hard to attract good teachers. The conditions are often worse. The neighborhoods are often not as good. And there's lots of other sort of stresses and so on. So the fact that we have racial segregation also means that we have these big differences in the quality of schools the Black, Hispanic, and white students attend. And one way to see that is to look at this. So on the horizontal axis here is the difference in the poverty rates of white and Black student schools. So 0 means white and Black students in this school district go to sort of equally poor or non-poor schools. And the further over that way you go, the more high poverty the Black student schools are relative to white students. And then the vertical measure here is a measure of the achievement gap between Black and white students in that school district. And you can see this very clear pattern. The school districts with a big disparity in the poverty rates of the schools of Black and white students also have the very largest achievement gaps. Those achievement gaps of the places on the far right are sort of more than 3 grade levels. And so these are very, very big achievement gaps. But the other thing to notice is that even in places with no segregation, that is the places kind of here on the left, you still have a big achievement gap. Segregation is not the only thing driving the achievement gap, but it's a big driver of the achievement gap. And so if we're going to sort of think about this equality of educational opportunity, we've got to take on segregation. Now, this is hard to do because it means thinking about housing policy and school policy together. You can't solve the sort of segregation problems just with schools. You've got to think about housing policy, and so that's a more complicated challenge for our next president. And the fourth thing I would say is if we're sort of going to address these issues, we've really got to focus on not just on the K-12 system, not just on the college system, not just on preschool, but all of them. That is, we need a kind of, there's not sort of a single silver bullet here. There's evidence. We know how to improve preschools. We know how to improve access to college. We know how to improve K-12 schools, but we know how to do that all in sort of small marginal ways. And none of them is sort of going to do it at the kind of scale we need to do. So Bernie Sanders and now Hillary Clinton have made a point of talking about making college affordable. If you look at the work of our colleague Raj Chetty, this is a picture that he made showing the probability of going to any college depending on your parents' income. And so if you're born in the bottom 10 or 20% family income, you have maybe a 30% chance of going to any college at all, community college, four-year college, whatever. And if you're born to one of the more affluent high-income families, you have a 90% chance of going to college. So there's a big gradient. Now, will making college free change this very much? Not if we don't also change the preparation for students. So we can't, it's sort of, I think, appealing to sort of say we'll make college free and that's going to change that. But if students aren't well prepared for college, if they aren't equally well prepared regardless of their background, we're still going to have similar disparities. You might move the bottom up a notch, but you're not going to move it dramatically without changing preparation. So how do we change K-12 preparation for schooling? Well, I mean, we haven't heard much about it this cycle, but a lot of the conversation in the sort of education policy circles is an argument about, should we use market-based sort of reform? Should we have charter schools? Should we have vouchers? Should we have school choice? Should we sort of try to use the market in order to do that? There's very little evidence that the market alone does a whole lot to improve education. If you really want to improve education, you have to think about what can you do to change what goes on in a classroom. And the best way to do that is to think about how you train teachers and to think about the kind of curriculum and standards. So things like the Common Core standards probably have more chance of changing the kind of things that go on in classroom, or improvements in teacher education programs. They're not as sort of sexy, maybe, or as talking point friendly as things like use the market to improve education. But schools, what happens in school really happens in the classroom. And so you really have to think about training teachers and changing what it is they focus their instruction on. The federal government doesn't have a lot of leverage to do that. The states have the leverage to do that. They control the curriculum. They get to adopt the Common Core or any other curriculum. So the federal government under the Obama administration tried to push states to adopt Common Core standards, and there was a big political backlash against that. So we have a kind of a hodgepodge system where some states now are on board with that and other states aren't. But the federal government doesn't have an enormous amount of say in this. So thinking about K-12 education, I think, means focusing on what happens in classroom. And then lastly, focusing on preschool education. I mean, the best way to make K-12 schools good is to make sure kids get to school with a kind of equal start and ready for school. If we look at the achievement gap by income, this is a study that follows children from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade, and at each wave of this study, I measured the size of the achievement gap by income. That's this axis. And you can see it's almost as big at kindergarten, almost as big even at age 4 as it is in 8th grade. The achievement gaps don't really develop in the K-12 years. They're there when kids get to school. So if you want to move towards more equal opportunity, doing it in early childhood is a kind of a key time. We know a lot about the importance of early childhood education, high quality preschool. There's great examples in Boston, in Tulsa, and some other places around the country of high quality preschools that really do a great job of getting low-income children sort of ready for school, and those kinds of models can be scaled up. The Obama administration put some money out there for states to take, and a lot of states didn't take it up, but I think continuing to incentivize states to invest more in their pre-K system will go a long way, I think, towards narrowing this. So I have little doubt that our next president will focus a lot on education because it's not kind of been a salient topic, but it's kind of always an important topic, and so I think it's always important to have these kind of stylized facts and ideas in the background of the conversation so that when education kind of gets on the front burner, we know the right way to talk about it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tomás, and CCSRE and all the other sponsors for inviting me to this talk. Yes, my name is Dominic Appel. I'm the research director for an organization, a national nonprofit organization called Race Forward. Our 3 areas of work are research, media, and practice. Our mission is actually to build awareness, solutions, and leadership for racial justice. Some of you may know us through our online news site called colorlines.com. We're the publisher of colorlines.com. We also have a biannual conference on racial justice. It's called Facing Race. It's actually happening this week in Atlanta, Georgia. It's unfortunately, it's all sold out, but you can follow us on our hashtag Facing Race. So please do check us out there. As far as racial justice, our definition at Race Forward is the systemic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. It's critical here that those 2 terms, systemic and outcomes. For us, it's not just about equal opportunity. It is actually about really keeping an eye on outcomes and the racial disparities that we see in our country. We see those as evidence of racism, evidence of what we would call systemic racism. So the 4 different dimensions of racism are two different levels that we'll talk about here. I'll talk about here: individual level racism on the left and systemic racism on the right. We focus again mainly on systemic racism. Most of us think about internalized and interpersonal levels of racism. So, internalized being, your own feeling of self-worth. People might use skin lightening creams. We have seen this in our country and others. Interpersonal racism, so interactions between people, our own prejudices and the tension, race relations. Those are important areas of racism, and again, those are the traditional ways that we really think about racism are those individual levels. But at Race Forward, we really want to focus and bring more and more attention to systemic levels of racism, institutional and structural. So again, briefly just going over those. So institutional racism occurs, again, within institutions. It involves discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices. So the policies and practices that impact the opportunities and ultimately outcomes. So one example would be, again, school systems, as Sean was mentioning, that concentrate people of color in overcrowded schools, underfunded, least experienced teachers. Structural racism is racial bias across institutions and society. So it's, again, the cumulative and compounding effects of multiple factors that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. One of the examples, again, that we provide, or we like to think about, is the racial wealth divide as well. So again, this is racism that cuts across institutions and societies. And there are different strategies to address, again, these different levels of racism. So there could be support groups for or racial healing for internalized racism or interpersonal diversity trainings. For us, again, focusing on the bottom two here, institutional racism, it's about changing policies and practices. And what I'm going to talk about today is in terms of changing employment practices. And again, structural racism, highlighting the history, the root causes of the racial disparities that we see in our country, changing myths about work and initiative for again people of color in particular. So I'm going to show this brief little video here about taking us back to 2008. And again, there was a lot of talk about this dawn of a post-racial America. So this is a few talking heads, pundits, the night of the election.
Turns out to be the case, President Obama. We have just achieved an incredible milestone for which the world needs to have more respect for the United States than it sometimes does.
Well, since we are about to elect the first African-American as president, it is a very significant historical fact. And I take it, therefore, around the world, criticism of the United States for being a racist nation will now stop, right?
The politics of racial grievance died tonight. No longer can people use the excuse of being blocked by other people. This former slaveholding republic has demonstrated to the world beyond question its commitment to democracy and inclusion.
So its commitment to democracy and racial inclusion. As we know, things like the treatment of President Obama have shown quite clearly that we did not enter a post-racial era. Just hitting one important milestone did not vacate, again, all the barriers that continue to exist in so many other areas. As Sean had mentioned as well, Black Lives Matter and the attention that it's brought to issues of systemic racism, institutional racism within police departments as well. This was one of the first elections I can think of where the term systemic racism actually came up in one of the presidential debates.
Dom, do you want to just plug the here? Sure. There's a little buzz here. I think this will work. There you go.
Great, thank you. And in terms of employment outcomes, so again, thinking about racial inequality, I want to focus in on some of the research that we've done on employment, on occupational segregation. So people of color really being in being shutted into low-income industries, particularly women of color, being in domestic work, being in also in occupational segregation within industries in sort of the lower-paying occupations as well. So we did some research in partnership with some worker organizations, Restaurant Opportunity Center United, amazing organization. Another one, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the Retail Action Project of New York. And so we looked at some government data as well in terms of the poverty rates. And so this is featured on our clockingin.org website as well. So looking at poverty rates, if you're just looking at the red here, it's the poverty rates. This is for white males within the retail industry from 1980 down to 2010 and 2012 at the bottom. As I toggle through, this is males of color. You can see that as the red is increasing, we're having increased rates of poverty in terms of the individuals employed again in that industry. For white women as well, slightly higher than rates of poverty than men of color in the industry. And then for again women of color, this is something we saw in many in multiple industries. It was the higher poverty rates for women of color, so as high as 20% there in that 2012 data. Looking at the restaurant industry, it's a similar thing. This is white males, men of color, white females, again over 20, just over 20% in the restaurant industry. And again, women of color as well, upwards of 25, 26% and higher. We also see in terms of high disparities in terms of the high incomes. So these, if you look at the right here, the greenish sections of these bar graphs. So at the top there it says it's females of color, then white females, then males of color, and then white males. So this is within the restaurant industry. Again, the higher incomes, those who make $60,000 or more, or $75,000 or more. Again, that bottom graph is white males. You have a higher percentage of white males in the restaurant industry who make those higher incomes. It's much smaller slivers for women of color, for white women in particular. This is when we look at managers of food establishments as well. Again, these are all racial disparities that we see, and they cut across many, many different industries. And this is just looking at the raw numbers in terms of the distribution in the industry. So white men are not the majority of the employees in the restaurant industry. At the bottom there you can see, but they are the majority of the managers, again, of food establishments. So we partnered again with these worker organizations to conduct focus groups to learn again more about the worker experiences, like what types of discrimination are workers experiencing nowadays? And this is, again, something that you can look at that clocking in site and sort of role play a bit in terms of some of the workers. Again, we heard about discrimination in terms of hiring, in terms of wages, in terms of the types of hours that they're able to secure. The treatment, how they're treated, again, by their managers, how rules are enforced differently, again, by race, the distribution of benefits, mobility, to what extent they're able to actually get promoted as well. This is something we really see in the restaurant industry in particular, where Black and Latino workers in the back of the house aren't getting opportunities to get employed in the higher wage front of the house positions. Now, all those areas are technically it's technically illegal to discriminate against workers across all those different types of or aspects of the workplace. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employers from discriminating against workers on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as well, and they get upwards of 90,000 employment discrimination claims every year. That statute actually requires them to investigate like each and every one of those. And actually, if a worker wants to bring up a claim or a lawsuit against their employer for employment discrimination, they actually have to wait for a what's called a right to sue authorization from the EEOC. So in theory, our system, and we have a new report coming out actually this week as well. It's called Confronting Racial Bias at Work, Challenges and Solutions to 21st Century Employment Discrimination. And so that'll be available again on our website just this Thursday. And we look at, and I'm not going to obviously ask you to look at all the words here on the screen, but just want to think about the different stages of the employment discrimination system. And again, this is something that our future president can address. And I'm also going to really ask you to think about the role that you as consumers can play as far as inequality in our employment system. So there's basically 6 basic stages of how our anti-discrimination system should work in theory. Again, the first is the work experience. A worker experiences discrimination and lodges an internal complaint at their work that goes that is not resolved. The worker, if they want to take it further, would initiate a Title VII claim with the EEOC. So it's filing a formal charge, and they again wait for the EEOC to investigate. Now, the EEOC, as many of you may know or can imagine, is not the most well-resourced federal agency, and so they're under-resourced, and it's very difficult for them to investigate each of these claims very quickly. So you have the stage 3 again, where the EEOC is theoretically supposed to investigate each of those claims, decide whether or not it's going to get involved itself. It may help the employer, the workers, or and it could actually join a lawsuit or try to negotiate the claims with the employer. Or it can again give it this right to sue authorization for the workers. So the next stage is a Title VII, some type of dispute. So the worker would make a case against her employer. It could be as part of a larger class actions lawsuit. If she's lucky, it's with the EEOC's formal assistance. And again, there would be either pre-court negotiations to get some type of either settlement and or to change the actual employment practices in the workplace. And after that, so that could happen again either in a negotiated settlement or before a court or during a court case. And some of these disputes actually do go all the way to again, a jury trial and decision. After that, again, there's some type of either again targeted compensation for the worker or workers, and the employer promises to make some changes in their practices that will be monitored again by the EEOC, federal courts, or others. And ideally, the EEOC helps spread the news to other employers, or other employers hear about these cases and change their practices so that the benefits of that dispute can be spread further, so that we can have employment practices again that will lead to again more equitable outcomes. So it's a bit, it's complicated in that there are, again, those 6 different stages, but theoretically it should work pretty simply through that system. But in practice, there are a lot of barriers that disadvantage workers in that system. And what we've been hearing, again, from worker advocates is that the Title VII system really doesn't work well. That workers don't have much trust in it. They don't feel like they really are going to. It's really going to end up benefiting them. So in our report, we talk about many of the different barriers, and so we just give a bird's eye view of the barriers that disadvantage workers in the Title VII system. And it's a case-by-case, slow case-by-case system, and it's really reactive. It's dealing with the discrimination after it has occurred. So there are things like forced arbitration clauses, confidential negotiated settlements. These are some aspects of the law actually that the law actually requires some confidentiality. In some respects, protects employers, but on the other hand, again, it doesn't allow us to better understand what practices are actually, what practices are impacting the outcomes. So I'm going to skip through these systemic barriers, but want to make the point that the EEOC does impose non-monetary remedies again on employers, including skipping to the second one, requiring hirings or promotions again by race, targeted recruitment again by race as well. Upgrading HR policies. So once an employer has been found guilty or negotiated a set course of action, these are some of the things that the EEOC does require of them. Record keeping requirements, progress and performance reports as well, or internal or external monitors. And but generally there's limited assessment. There's really limited, assessment of the work that of these non-monetary remedies. So the EEOC, from our vantage point, really needs to do a better job of understanding which of these specific remedies are key to actually changing practices. So I'm going to skip through. In the interest of time, and say that in our new report, again, it's Confronting Racial Bias at Work, we argue that we need to shore up our reactive system of anti-discrimination, so the Title VII system that is being created, but we also need to provide more equity pressures and more incentives and ultimately mandates for employers. So we need to have more proactive solutions to address employment discrimination on the front end, as opposed to dealing with it after it has already occurred. And so we can do this in many ways, but again, my charge to you all is that it's important for consumers who are racial and social justice-ly inclined, in particular, to support businesses, to support efforts to have fair food labels, to make sure that we're able to, again, put that pressure, ideally on employers, to ultimately to voluntarily implement the best employment practices that, again, that are ultimately going to change racial justice outcomes. So I'll leave it at that.